Hi, I'm Margot Nash, Product Development Director for Hireology, and welcome to today's Fridays in the Lab. Today's lesson, Interviewing 101, the tips for success. The process of interviewing deserves special attention because it requires personal judgment on your part. Creating internal interviewing practices or processes will help you be more reliable in your judgments and more accurate in your decisions regarding who to hire into your organization. Today, we'll kickstart your interview training by going through a couple common interview rater errors and tips to avoiding violating them. The first step to avoiding rater errors and biases is to be aware of the common errors made. For this reason, it can be helpful to keep a list of these errors handy to refer to in order to catch yourself when you're making inferences that are judgmental and subjective. Here are some basic errors that are important to be aware of. First, central tendency. Avoiding high or low ratings. We call this the commitment phobe. This type of error occurs when a rater avoids extreme scores on a rating scale by giving ratings that are always at the midpoint of a scale, regardless of the behavior seen in response to questioning about particular dimensions. Then there's contrast effect, when the quality of the previous candidate affects ratings of the current candidate. We've all done it. This type of error occurs when information from prior interviews influences the present interview, thus providing inaccurate ratings. Next, there's first impression, rating the candidate based on an initial impression. Don't be a superficial Sally. The tendency to let initial first impressions and superficial judgments influence overall ratings rather than placing more weight on the actual information and responses provided by the interviewee during the interview. Then there's leniency effect, otherwise known as the nice guy. This tendency or error occurs when the interviewer gives ratings that are higher than the applicant actually deserves. The rater may feel uncomfortable giving a rating score that is either average or below average, especially when the ratee uses tactics to create an uncomfortable environment, like candidates perhaps crying or mentioning tragedies or talking about sensitive information, thus compensates by inflating the evaluation. Using well-defined questions will help in subsiding any misunderstanding or ambiguities, thus reducing this error effect. On the other hand, there's severity effect, or being too tough, or the Curmudgeon Effect. This tendency occurs when the rater, or the interviewer, gives ratings that are lower than the interviewee actually deserves, and based on unreasonable or unjustified standards. There's also similarity effect, or ratings based on traits that you have in common, or the you're like me effect. This error pertains to the tendency to give higher ratings to those applicants that appear and seem similar to you, the rater. Additionally, raters will be adjusted in a negative direction if there's a lack of perceived and/or actual similarity. This similarity may be relevant to commonalities of race, heritage, thought, ethnicity, and religion, as well as background and experiences and shared goals. Finally, here's some tips to avoid making these errors. Number one, take the time to clarify uncertainties and understand the competencies that are involved in the interview. To ensure fairness and equality to any candidate, interviewers need to have a list of job-related interview questions and use it consistently for all applicants for the same position. According to law, if the question is not related to performance on the job, it should not be asked at all. The employer must demonstrate a job-related necessity for asking any question. If this is not the case, the EEOC could examine it to determine if any discrimination has occurred. Next, it can be helpful to keep a list of common rater errors and be aware of what they mean and how to avoid them. Develop well-defined competencies and anchored rating scales for those competencies. Use job-relevant questions that are well-written and logical, as well as appropriate probing questions. Take detailed, thorough, and exact notes during the interview or after. Evaluate each candidate on an individual basis, avoiding comparisons and carryover. Review your notes and rating anchors in order to select the appropriate level that matches the observed behaviors. And that concludes today's Fridays in the Lab.